Welcome to the Post Shift Podcast, your raw look at the hospitality industry, brought to you by SHC. What is happening, Post Shifters? Welcome back to another episode of the Post Shift Podcast. Of course, I'm your host, Shawn Soole. This week's episode is with Dave Mitton, the global brand ambassador for JP Wiser's, based out of Toronto. He's a very good old friend of mine. I'm really looking forward to this conversation. We chatted very, very early in my podcast career at San Antonio Cocktail Week in 2019. So he's probably one of my very, very first episodes. And it was a fun episode. We had to move locations 3 times because of noise. I had dinky microphones kicking around. So I'm really looking forward to having this chat again. I think I've had him on the show 2 more times since then, like for happy hours during the pandemic. But I'm really looking forward to seeing where he stands with Canadian whiskey and the future of the brand and the category. If you're liking the podcast, please go ahead and subscribe, like, comment, do whatever you do on any of the platforms. Give me a review. Really hope you enjoy this episode, guys. Thanks a lot. Welcome, Dave. How are you, buddy?
Hello, Mr. Soole. Good to be back.
It is crazy. I was thinking about our friendship, and I think I met you Harvard Room 2009.
Yeah, you were brand new and fresh to the country, were you not?
Yeah, I was. I actually was in town to do City TV, and I was there with Kevin Brush. And I remember being at Harvard Room, and I had to be on TV at like 6 a.m. in the morning. And my wife called, and she said, "You're still out?" I'm like, "Yes." Like, we're just hitting one more place. She's like, "You have to be on TV at 6 a.m. tomorrow morning. Get to bed." I'm like, "Yes, dear." And I went, called a cab, and went back to my hotel straight away.
I remember how responsible you were. I was very impressed.
29-year-old. The beard was not there, or hell, if he even had a beard, could grow a beard then, it would be very, very brown, not white like it is now. So you're very well known in the industry, but for the listeners at home, how did you get into hospitality, and how did Harvard Room come around? Like, what's your story?
I mean, how long do we have? It's been a long time. Grew up in a small town, New Brunswick, right on the water in the East Coast, Canada. Never wanted to do the university thing. I wanted to go travel and see the world. My parents thought it was a great idea, and they said, "You're going to have to pay for it on your own." And I went out on an adventure and went through Australia, New Zealand, Asia, Europe for several years, and fell in love with traveling, fell in love with the bar world, because that was how I started working in the bar scene, from bar backing, doing security, getting bar gigs. I've worked, my first role was as a bathroom attendant, working illegally somewhere where I didn't have papers, and just, eventually found my way behind the bar, and, got to the show, got to be able to bartend, and fell in love with the spirits and beer and wine world, but really fell in love with the cocktail world. And there wasn't a real big cocktail world in the late 90s, early 2000s. Yeah. There wasn't websites to check out, magazines to buy, even books. Like, we were scouring old cocktail books and to find out how to make a Manhattan or a Vieux Carré, and essentially fell in love with the classics. Made my way back to Canada, found myself in Toronto, opened up my first place with a friend called Chahosky. It was an old butcher shop from the 1920s.
There's a painting right behind you.
Yeah, this is my memory every day, having coffee, of what not to do when opening a bar and restaurant. It was business-wise, it was a bit of a shit show, but as far as anything from the outside, we were doing well. We were busy. I tried to bring in classic cocktails from the 1920s to try to go with this old sign that was put up in 1923. And Toronto was not ready in 2004 for classic cocktails.
I remember watching, because it was on Opening Soon. And I think that's where I remember learning about you, was Opening Soon, which is a very, very old TV show for the kids out there that was on like cable network, and I think it was on Old School Food Network. And it was one of the ones that was part of the show. And that's how I think I remember not connecting with you, but like actually finding out about you.
Got you. Yeah. I'll have someone every once in a while be on a plane and send me a text going that you're on. They'll have reruns of opening soon. I'm like, holy Christ, that was from the early 2000s. Like that's literally 20 years old now. Uh, but yeah, we got a lot of attention. It took us 2.5 years to build the place while paying rent. And I was living there at one point because we couldn't afford rent in Toronto and rent at the restaurant while it was being built. So we were very fortunate. We got a lot of great accolades when it did open. The cocktail scene was by no means happening yet. So the very little bit that we were doing was getting some attention from drink writers because it was different for the city of Toronto or even in Canada. But as far as consumers went, I was trying to put out classics, boozy and stirred. I was just hoping I was getting the recipes right. And we'd have the suits coming in from the business districts. We were a bit of a hot spot, and they would order a Manhattan or a Negroni, and they would just push it back and be like, dude, that's all booze. I'm like, yep, that's what the menu read. But, and, we had to readjust back in 2004. And that was where I found myself like, we didn't have mentors in Canada, the bar scene back then, not for the cocktail world. And I had access to books like from Douglas Ankra over in the UK and Dale DeGroff, and they were blowing my mind because in these books they were using things like fresh juice and bitters and things that we couldn't get in Canada yet. Or sorry, we could get fresh juice, we weren't using it. And that's where I found myself muddling berries and using different herbs, and I was kind of forced into creating my own cocktails when I hadn't even really understood the classics yet, if that makes sense.
Yep.
So I did lean towards the kitchen crew a lot back then, because they would say things like, oh, you've got a bunch of Pernod, some pastis you need to use, like blend that with some chocolate. And I'm like, what are you talking about? And then, you try it and be like, oh, this is pretty good. So we started putting out some pretty wild things that it wasn't even really my style at the time, but I was certainly learning what not to do and what to do and what worked and Toronto and Canadian palates.
Yeah, like I remember, I think, to be honest, I think I watched that opening soon episode while I was still in Australia because I didn't come here till 2006. So I think I remember watching late night Food Network and opening soon, and was like blown away with just that show was very, very good. So fast forward, Harvard Room, was that your second venue that you did?
Technically third, because with the group we were doing Chosky with, we did a spot across the street, which was a Spanish place where it was kind of standing, and it was kind of more, well, it was definitely cocktails more influenced from places like Spain and Portugal. But guess what? 2005, that the city wasn't really into it.
10 years ahead of the curve.
We were trying, and then I actually went over to Europe with my girlfriend at the time, and we spent almost a month there just traveling through Italy and Spain and Portugal and France. And I came to a realization that I just spent the last few years of my life like never taking a day off, and working for somebody who was a partner but a big investor that weren't letting us really do what we want. And two of my dear friends, Chris Sheeky and Corey Vitiello, wanted to do a spot with me, and we found a space up on Harvard Street. And at the time, it was like, oh my God, Harvard Street up in the annex. Like, I only know Queen Street West. I don't know this area. And we managed to get the space, and it was so small. Like, Chahosky was 3 floors with a big rooftop patio. And that was I was thrown into something that I wasn't ready to do yet. But this little spot, we were like, okay, we can probably have 30 seats inside, 10 at the bar, 30 outside. And we took about half a year to build the place instead of 2.5 years, because we'd learned a lot of what to do and what not to do in that time.
2.5 years is a long time.
Yeah, especially when you're paying rent.
Yeah.
I could have owned a really nice house in Toronto at that point. But anyway, live and learn. When we did Harvard Room, I was like, I really want to go back to these classic cocktails because I had been so intrigued with them for the last couple of years that I was learning. I was going down to places, taking a bus on a Sunday night at midnight to New York City So the next day I could go sit at Milk and Honey or Flatiron or PDT and get to know these guys and gals making the drinks and watching them and asking them about the fresh juices, asking them about the ice programs. Like, it was just wild to me. And when we came back and we had a little 30-seat restaurant, it was like, we can do this. We can do an ice program. We can do fresh juices. And I'm like, I'm going to do this. I'm going to stick to it. And, again, worked with Corey and his menu, because when we opened up, we were very fortunate. We got a lot of press because opening a restaurant at that time, 30 seats we were told how we were doing the wrong thing. If you're going to open a proper restaurant in Toronto, it should have 60 to 100 seats, because all of the very, very successful restaurants with no cocktail programs but great wine programs back then was just that. I think I laugh now. I was looking for an article a couple months ago and came across one of our first write-ups, and the very well-respected food writer was going on about the cocktails and how they were not used to it, but they also couldn't grasp that our staff that had tattoos on their arms were knowledgeable in food and drink. Think about that. Like, that doesn't make me sound old right now. They were talking about staff being tattooed, but actually understanding the bar and restaurant industry. So yeah, we were fortunate. It was luck. It was the right time. People wanted to talk about something different in Toronto, so everyone was writing about this small little restaurant that was probably too small in their eyes. We were doing cocktails, classics, and then we kind of watched it progress. Like, a year later, places like the Black Hoof opened, and really helped bring that out. And within a couple of years, cocktails had exploded around the city, and we were certainly seeing it. I mean, it was already going in Vancouver and the West Coast, and thanks to people like you, it was happening. But it did start to grow. Like, the first few years, there were less than 10 of us in Toronto that were doing cocktails, which is pretty wild to think.
It is crazy when you talk to the younger generation of bartenders, and you're like, I remember, like you said, bitters. I remember when Cynar hit the market. Like, I remember when you could actually get Peychaud's easily without having to smuggle any back from like the US. And they're like, oh no, that's and then they just don't connect with like how easy it is to get stuff these days, how open it is for everything, information, tools, picture, like anything you need, you can get somehow.
Yeah. If someone asks for a cocktail that you don't know the specs, it's a quick turnaround in Google because you've gone to get ice. Where back then you'd be like, you didn't want to come off foolish. You'd be like, oh, how do you normally like that?
Yeah.
I like that Diamondback. And you didn't know what it was. You couldn't Google what it was. There just weren't websites set up yet.
So how did the JP Wiser's brand ambassadorship come up for you? Because again, that was early in the day. Did you celebrate your 10 years with JP Wiser's?
Yeah, we just this past June was my 10 years in the role.
Wow.
And
So,
I mean, was sorry, I just cut you off.
that's okay. But like, that's 2014. So like, even then, there was only a handful of brand ambassadors in the world. Like, brands weren't seeing brand ambassadorship as a sort of a legitimate role. How did it come back around for you?
Well, I mean, kind of at the time, it was more of, as you remember, it was like global brand ambassadors were a thing, but again, not huge. Like, you had Angus Winchester from Tanqueray, you had Claire from Belvedere, Demi from Grey Goose, you had Simon Ford, and
Raj Nagra.
Yeah, and it was like for the big brands, basically a lot of the vodka and gin brands. And from my experience, we used to get so excited when the global brand ambassador would come through Toronto, because it'd be a crazy seminar. Because again, we weren't getting education from brands back then at all. And again, there weren't tons of books to look to. So if a global brand ambassador came to town, everybody was running to their seminar, and then you would hope they would come to your bar at night so you could make them a cocktail with their spirit. And Harbor met a lot of that, and it was great. So I get to know a lot of these guys and gals that were coming to town over the years. And in my mind, there was never a moment in time where I was thinking I would be a brand ambassador, because I'd been bartending since the early 90s, and I owned a couple spots at that point, and I was like, this is probably it. I love this. This is great. And it was a very large gin brand. They probably don't want me to say their name. So it was a very large gin brand reached out and said, listen, we're holding almost auditions, and we're choosing some figureheads from countries. Would you be willing to apply for this global ambassador role as the person applying from Canada? And I thought, I'm not going to do this. Like, it would be moving to London, and I had the businesses, and the person kind of convinced me. I'm like, all right, I'll go through the interview process, because I'm just curious now. And I think of how bad my interview process was, because I wasn't somebody who looked after brands, and I'm like, they must have thought I was a fool during the few online interviews, which were virtual, which was very strange to have a virtual interview.
Was it through Skype as well, through old school Skype?
Yeah. And apparently I got down to very close. There were a few people, but I didn't get it. And it went to the right person, very good person. But during that, the spirits industry is, people talk just as much as the bar and cocktail industry. So word got out that I had applied, and Corby Spirit and Wine and Pernod Ricard reached out and said, are you trying to be a brand ambassador? I was like, well, I kind of explained to them, and they said, this is when the interview process was going on. They're like, please don't say yes to anything. Give us 2 weeks. We want to present something to you. And I was intrigued, and basically they came back and said, we'd like to create a role for a Canadian whiskey ambassador. And I mean, that essentially didn't exist at that point. There were figureheads like Dan from Canadian Club and whatnot, but like, as far as brand ambassadors going out and doing big trainings and stuff, it wasn't a thing for Canadian whiskey yet, and a very misunderstood spirit category. But they thought I would fit the role of a Canadian whiskey ambassador, the messy hair and beard and denim. And basically it was a year contract where I thought, talking to my business partners, they're like, yeah, okay, you just have to travel across Canada and the US a little bit. And I was like, yeah, it's a couple times a month maybe. And then it quickly turned to about 40 weeks a year I was on the road. And, but didn't have a clue what to do. Like, was doing anything I saw other brand ambassadors do. Go buy drinks, talk a little bit about what's in the bottle, what kind of a cocktail you can make with this. And, specifically, because I know you were always into Canadian whiskeys too, that Canadian whiskeys weren't really thought of in the classic cocktail world, even though they had a large presence at one point. I quickly learned how many people across Canada and certainly the US didn't know anything about the category. I learned how much I didn't know about the category, to be quite honest. And, getting to work with people like Dr. Don Livermore, our master blender, and everyone at the distillery, and amazing people like Davin DeCurgamo, who were willing to give me time to ask questions. And thankfully I had his book to go through history. And I decided really quickly that we had to keep having fun, but we needed to change the whole program and create it and just create pure education on the category along with the brands. And that was what kind of really hooked me, because people weren't into a Canadian whiskey. Even Canadians weren't, as far as the bar and cocktail scene went. And I'm stubborn. So I took it on as a bit of a personal mission, where I was like, I want to see people using their national spirit in drinks and to have pride in their national spirit. Because at that time, there were some really great brands coming out, like ours in particular, Lot 40 and Gooderham and Wards, and JP Wiser's has always done great things, but 40 Creek was doing amazing things. And And, there was no reason that we couldn't be using our own national spirit along with some American whiskeys to work on classic cocktails. And, obviously use them to focus on some originals, which has been great to see. And I mean, it just kept going. We brought Gina Fawcett on. I was very fortunate that I'm still 8 years later working side by side with her. She's based out of Chicago. I don't know anyone that has more education on the spirits world than she does, especially in the whiskey categories. So she's been amazing to have at my side, where she spearheads now we created the first certification course on Canadian whiskey, the ABCs of Canadian whiskey, and she spearheads that. And we're up to over 500 certified students across the world right now.
That's very cool. I always find with Canadian whiskey, people are like, if they do like Canadian whiskey as a consumer, they like their brand, that expression, and to get them over the edge. Like, I only like JP Wise's original. And you're like, but why don't you just try the 15-year-old? It's like $1 or $2 more, or the 18-year-old. Nope, I just like this one. Why can't I just have this one?
It's very true, especially with the older generation, where it's like very true to a brand. Mm-hmm. And I respect that. It's nice when you're at a whiskey show or spirit festival to get people to try other things. And I've got a friend's father who I'll go to their cottage up in Georgian Bay once in a while. And it's like, it's very lovely part of the world. And there's a few cottages, and all the old boys in their 70s, they're very stuck on their scotch. But I saw them this summer and they were like, you changed us. And I said, what do you mean? And they're like, the group of us are now drinking Lot 40 Dark Oak instead of single malt scotch. And I was like, are you kidding me? And I was like, that's incredible. I was like, because you boys don't change your mind. You're in your 70s and 80s. And here they are. They've switched from single malt scotch to a pot stilled rye whiskey out of Canada. But I learned this quickly in the role. I was trying to change people's minds, and I was trying to change a lot of minds of middle-aged men who were just like, nope. They were either in America going, we're not drinking Canadian whiskey, mm-hmm. or they were in Canada going, this is our brand. I was like, fair. And then, the light bulb went off, and I'm like, why am I tackling all these people who don't want to change their mind or even think about trying something new? Mm-hmm. And we really just started focusing on the bar community and the young up-and-comers who were very open-minded about any spirit category, whatever country it came from. They're sponges. They wanted to learn. And that just changed everything for us. We started seeing cocktail placements on menus. We started seeing them put it in their well. We started seeing them grab for it when they want to get creative. Like, it just, it wasn't working with people my age and up. We had to go younger, and it's been working much nicer the last several years doing it that way.
And this year for Tales of the Cocktail, you won Brand Ambassador of the Year. I can see the plate behind your...
Yes, I had that. I was like, I asked somebody who had one, I was like, where'd you put it? And someone was like, oh, it's on our wall. Somebody was like, it's in the drawer. I'm like, I'm not putting that in the drawer. But I'm also like, I'm not hanging it up over my bed. So I thought my little cabinet of whiskey books and cocktail books would be a nice place to put it. I was really honored. I don't even know if it's truly set in yet, but it was...
Yeah, it seems like you're super uncomfortable at talking about the accolade.
Hey, it was a great year, and I'm so proud to be recognized by the judges and my peers. There's no higher honor. Like, it's incredible. And I was very fortunate where I was nominated a few years prior to this, and I was just so excited to be nominated. Like, it sounds so cliche. And I never took it. I was like, that's great. I was nominated. Like, top 4 is awesome. Top 10 is amazing. Like, and it was this year where I didn't say this on stage because so many people do, and I don't know if it's true or not, but it was for me, where it was the day before the awards, and Gina, my counterpart in Chicago, we do all of our events together at Tales, and she looked at me and she's like, "You've written a speech, right?" I was like, "No." I was like, I got some points that I might do if it happens. And she was just shook her head. She was like, "Just write bullet points at the very least." And I was like, "You're right. Because what if this happens?" So I admit, when Nicola and Vance were up on stage, and I kind of felt Nicola look my way for a minute, which I didn't know. And I went, "Oh my God. Oh God." And the judges are not supposed to know. They never know. They pull the envelope and it's a true surprise. But she was telling me later that something had happened with the envelope. So they actually had to look to make sure they had the right one. So she was like, "Christ, I went out on stage and I knew." She was like,
and
"I was
she
trying
and she does not have a
not,"
poker face
she was like,
whatsoever.
"I'm trying not to look at you." But it was that thing like, "Oh my God, they're going to call my name, I think." And they did. And, I went up and I was like, "It's cool. I'm not going to get emotional." And I got up and I was just so nervous and so excited. And you get emotional because you're looking at 450
Mm.
people that you admire and, like really admire. And like they're the best in the world that are invited there. And it kind of hits you like, holy shit, I'm up on stage in front of these people. And yeah, it's been pretty overwhelming. I mean, it's 2 months ago now. But people still, it's pretty funny when you walk in a room or you get a call or when someone introduces you. It's a little silly now, but I mean, I had a very dear friend. They're like, "Embrace it for the next year because it's
Yeah,
going to be gone in a year's time." And I'm like, "You're right."
it's very Canadian of you, Dave.
Uh, I
So
mean, I would say I do get shy about it, but it's like, yeah, that you're the first person that I've ever spoken about it, like online or in an interview. And I mean, that's just from the heart.
appreciate that. So with JP Wise, you've been with them for 10 years. With such a rich history, how do you and Gina, like how do you when you plan these events and these educationals, how do you balance this rich history of JP Wise's, but also the innovation for Canadian whiskey? Because Canadian whiskey, I've always said Canadian whiskey rules are you can either use them for good or evil.
Yep.
Like you can either use the rules for good and make really great whiskey, or use them for evil and put rye whiskey on your label when you're 100% corn. How do you balance this innovation plus the tradition?
I like that, the good or evil. And I always say similar. I'm like, the rules allow you if you want to be a little lazy and just put out like a really double, triple, quadruple column distilled corn. So
Mhm.
there's not a whole lot of flavor, and put it in an old wooden barrel for a minimum of 3 years. Like you get a Canadian whiskey. Or if you want to take advantage of the fact that by tradition, all of the grains can be fermented separately, are distilled separately, and you can concentrate up flavors that you want. You can strip away flavors you don't want. And then you can age for minimum 3 years to be a Canadian whiskey, any type you want, any proof you want. Um, it's pretty cool. And there's obviously some more rules in there, but we've got 100% rye, we've got 100% corns, we've got column distilled, double column distilled, we've got column and pot distilled, we've got things aged in any type of cask you can imagine. We've got whiskeys as young as 4 to 5 year blends, and we've just released a 42-year-olds. I mean, our proofs come out at different things. We've got single distillates and we've got 7 distillate whiskeys blended together. So this. The opportunities are endless for innovation.
Mm.
And Dr. Don, our master blender, and Amy Levesque, our head distiller, like, man, them and their teams can have a lot of fun. So with our history, like you say, when we were doing the course, the first little bit is all about history. You look at someone like Davin's book on Canadian whiskey, and that like our history is extremely rich, and it's stuff that we don't know about, we don't learn in school, America doesn't know about, the rest of the world doesn't know about, but we've got decades and decades. We've got history from the mid 1800s up until now that we can talk about, and watching rules and regulations change over the years, from Canada being the first country in the world to mandate an aging law to our 9.09 rule that started in the mid 1800s, where you can blend in aged spirits like Jamaican rum or a cognac. And we don't take advantage of that rule very often because, quite frankly, it's less expensive to barrel age than add a spirit in. But there's some brands like that are taking advantage of the 9.09 rule, and they're doing some really cool things. So I think it's great if Canada does embrace that rule, because you can get innovative with it, really innovative. But yeah, we do kind of a mixture. We try to blow people's minds by going into the history, because there's so much with real people that the brands are still going all these years later. Like JP Weiser's, for instance, in the US, Lot 40 has been around since the late 90s. It went away and it came back 2012. So it's an innovative, amazing cult following brand, but it doesn't have the history of something like JP Weiser's or Gooderham and Worts. Like JP Weiser's one of the biggest selling whiskeys in Canada, if not maybe the biggest right now. It's from 1857. It's been around longer than a brand like Jack Daniels.
Yeah.
Which, that, every time I say it, that's mind-blowing. And you go to America, and I mean, some of the northern states will know JP Weiser's, but we're basically introducing a new brand to everyone, which is also great. It's like a restaurant. If everyone knows your restaurant's there and your sales are at one point, you can't get busier. If everybody knew about JP Weiser's in the US, we'd have no chance at our sales going up. The fact that so many people don't, and when we introduce it to people and they like it and they buy it, like, it's not going to happen overnight, but we have all the room in the world to grow right now.
How is the US market for, because obviously the US has their own rye, so it has to be 51% rye, where we do a lot of 100% up here. How does when you travel to the US, how is the appeal for the bar community when it comes to Canadian whiskey in general, and especially JP Weiser's?
Yeah. So, I mean, Gina and I, in our course, we always, one of the weeks is like Canadian versus American. And we specify on American rye versus Canadian whiskey. But we always like to point out, for instance, the US has they had 36, now they have 37 categories of different whiskey. That's 37 categories of different rules and regulations. So Canadian whiskey will often get compared to American rye, which, like you say, American rye or American straight rye, which are two different categories, but it's made completely differently from Canadian whiskey. So it's not really fair to compare. Now, if you're using a brand like Lot 40, you can compare it to a straight rye because it's made the exact same way, but the fact that it's made in Canada makes it a Canadian whiskey, where we have one category. As you brought up earlier, like, you could put Canadian rye whiskey on a label and it could be 100% corn, which makes it confusing for people. Or we get compared to, people will hear American blended, and you'll have a lot of, I don't want to say Americans, but people will turn their nose down when they hear blended, especially in the US. They'll turn their nose down to a blended Scotch, a Canadian blended whiskey. And it was Gina that pointed this out to me a couple years ago. And we're including this now in our education, and it just blew my mind. So, like you say, 37 categories of American whiskey. You've got like American straight bourbon, American straight rye. Like, that's right up there with single malt Scotch. Like, very strict rules and regulations, has to be made a certain way. You know what you're getting. And then you can go all the way down to like American blended. People, for instance, if you're in the US, there's a Seagram's American blended whiskey. People see Seagram's, they assume it's Canadian, but the label says American blended whiskey. The category American blended whiskey, you're allowed 80% neutral grain spirit into the blend.
Oh.
Hey, that's one of their 37 categories, and it's like, that's the rules of it, and that's what it is. But people hear blended and they assume that places like Canada and Scotland can do the same thing, where it is not true. Canada, Scotland, Ireland, Japan, like, it's illegal to put neutral grain spirit into our whiskeys or sugar. Like, but then that category would confuse people, because if you can put 80% vodka in your whiskey bottle as an American blended, it makes things confusing.
Well, I think that's the hard thing sometimes, especially being here in Canada. I remember doing my WSET, my CSS, and we don't get to see a lot of those spirits come over the border to Canada. Same thing with Irish whiskey. We just don't get that influence from the US. So there was a couple of questions that threw me for a loop, because we never see them up here. They're quality products that are really, really good. And so we get a certain benchmark. And so, yeah, I have been to a couple of liquor stores in the US. I'm like, what is this? What is this?
Yeah. Well, and speaking of that, great segue. It's like, you go to I was in Florida a few weeks ago, and you go to like one of their Walmart liquor stores, and it's incredible, because you go through like the American whiskey section, the Irish whiskey section, and it's so much more than we can get here in Ontario, at least. I know places like Alberta is much better. But you'll go to the Canadian whiskey section, and I'll see 20 to 30 brands of Canadian whiskey that are not sold in Canada. And that is an American company buying up, like you say, a 3-year-old corn whiskey, something very inexpensive from one of the big 8 distilleries, could be from us. And they're putting it in a bottle that is camouflaged, and there's a guy on it that looks like Brad Pitt holding a gun, and he's got a couple wolves next to him. And they're saying Canadian whiskey, and it's $7.99 for a liter and a half.
Jesus.
And then next to it is Lot 40 Dark Oak, and it won World's Best Rye, and it's $59. And they're like, well, I'm going to buy the Canadian whiskey that's $7.99 opposed to this one, because it's not working at it slowly, but like the knowledge isn't out there to the general public. I mean, I can only get to so many people at once, and that's why we are focusing on the younger generation with our students, to hopefully that they'll help guide and educate people as time goes on.
And everybody listening, like, there literally is a brand. I'm not going to say the brand. There literally is a brand in Canada that is 100% corn, and it says Canadian rye whiskey on the label.
Yeah.
Like, there is a brand. I'm not going to say it. You can go do your research. That's a perfect next section. What's your biggest challenges and opportunities for Canadian whiskey over the next decade? Like, you're the global brand ambassador. You get to see the markets that are shifting and changing. What are the biggest challenges and opportunities for Canadian whiskey going forward?
Great question. I mean, if anything right now, it's like, let's just say we're challenges with whiskey as a whole. Like, I mean, there'd be a couple. Like, in the whiskey category, I always do every year the whiskey show in London. One of the premier whiskey shows in all of UK and Europe, certainly in the UK. It is mind-blowing. It's such an honor to be there in a booth, but then to walk around is just crazy to see the stuff that's there. Now, when I started at that show 8 years ago, I can tell you that there were, out of, let's say there's 450 booths, 5 or 6 were North American whiskeys. Just, we were one of them. As far as anything 100% rye went, Lot 40 was it. Like, wow. And I'd go and look, like, there were no 100% ryes at those booths. Now, 8 years later, if you walked in with me and said, I'd like some 100% rye, I would say, what country?
Yeah.
Because, and it's like the rye category's caught on. I mean, Ireland's putting out ryes. Like, whether it's Poland or Croatia, there's 100% ryes coming out of everywhere. So the competition has gone to the roof on 100% rye whiskeys. As far as the Canadian whiskey category, I mean, I don't think American whiskey's ever been hotter. Like, it's exploding around the world. Look at what's happening in the Irish whiskey world. It's not just 2 brands anymore. It's a lot of Irish whiskey.
A lot of Irish whiskey out there.
I mean, even like Scottish whiskey, always kind of in the premium category for sipping on. I mean, they're really pushing the boundaries of using it in cocktails more. So there's so much more competition. Even Canadian whiskey producers, like, there's over 300 distilleries across the country now. Now, mind you, a lot of those are not going out of their provinces, out of the country. But like you say, in the next decade, I'm sure that's going to change.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, another challenge right now, just for any kind of whiskey, let alone Canadian whiskey or any kind of spirit, whether it be rum or agave, gins, like people are drinking less spirits.
Yeah.
The 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 categories everywhere. I mean, this is part of my job. You're sitting in all the studies and reports, and the amount of RTDs that people in Ontario are drinking is staggering.
Mm-hmm.
So, as a spirit company, how are you, the top brass, the bosses making all the big decisions and be like, well, everyone's drinking RTDs. That, their job is to make money for the company. So,
Mm-hmm.
RTDs are becoming a huge thing right now. Certainly in Canada and the US, like it's never been bigger. Um, Canada, Ontario, I don't have the stats in front of me, but it's terrifying. It's for me,
Yeah.
I'm like, oh my God, everyone's just drinking canned cocktails right now.
Well, coming
So
from
I've
Australia, like Australia's RTD culture is insane. It has been for decades. Like I remember working at nightclubs and literally we didn't have rails. We just had banks of fridges with every RTD you can possibly imagine. You just go up to the bar and you go, I want a Jack and Coke or a Johnny Walker and Ginger. Like,
yeah.
and that's pretty much a can, crack. There you go. Off you go.
When I lived there in the 90s, it was like, yeah, you grabbed a bunch of RTDs to put in the esky and go to the beach.
Exactly.
And
Exactly.
it
Like,
made sense. I was like, yeah, makes perfect sense.
I
So
said to a friend the other day about generational drinking and how it's changed up. And I was like, the next generation we nurtured to talk about their feelings and be in touch with their feelings, and now they don't drink because they don't need to drink anymore to suppress the feelings that they have to deal with. Like, I want to go back to the old days.
yeah. Well, I mean, I considered it a privilege. It's not really part of my job, but it's kind of just remain part of my job where, you know, if you live this, you people like you and Gordon Hanna and Evelyn Chick live this. Like post pandemic, the amount of bartenders that were just gone
Mm-hmm.
and now all real estate agents or moved on to whatever category. There were so many spots to be filled that it was people coming in with a little bit of knowledge, people coming in with no knowledge whatsoever and being given
Mm-hmm.
positions that they really should have more knowledge. It was a shaky couple of years. I mean, it's now like seeing it, I'm like, oh, this is coming together. Like
Mm-hmm.
they had to go and learn the hard way that we did because we didn't have mentors and they didn't because their mentors had moved on to something else like brand ambassador
Yeah.
or real estate agent. So I put myself out there. I did throughout the entire pandemic and it kind of caught on. And I'm saying it now if anyone's watching, this week it was two different people, but people will reach out and they'll set aside like 30 minutes. And it's a business interaction where they're like, can I have you for 30 minutes? I'm like, yeah. I was like, put your questions together. Cause I was like, I don't
Yeah.
have time to ramble on for an hour, but I'm like, put your questions together. I'll help you however I can. One woman this week, I was in Detroit and she was in Toronto and she reached out and we had a great 20-minute conversation. She's written me a couple times since, and I'm trying to help guide her in what she's looking to do. And now I'm rambling. Surprise, surprise. Uh, Point being is part of my job's been, I don't want to use the word mentoring, but
Mm-hmm.
kind of being there to help any way I can with new young bar folk. Because I love seeing where it's going. I mean, they're smarter than us. That's where I was going. They're not drinking as much as we did. They're not working the hours we did. They're not bragging that they're doing 18-hour shifts. They've got a better work-life balance.
Mm-hmm.
And they're seeing us. They're seeing people in their 40s and 50s who are ex-bartenders and they might have a bit of a limp. Or
Yeah.
they'll talk about how their elbows hurt or their neck hurts. And they're smarter than us. They have learned from us on what not to do.
Yeah. That's very, very true. What advice would you give someone to break into the whiskey industry? Like, if someone wants to come work at JP Wise's, what's the best piece of advice, whether it be marketing, brand ambassadorship, working at the distillery? What's the best piece of advice for someone who wants to break into the whiskey industry?
I had a conversation a couple weeks ago because Corby right now has some brand ambassador roles up. So one's a whiskey, one's a rum, tequila. There's a few if you went on the website. So I've had people reaching out to me. Some are bartenders, some are bar managers, some no experience whatsoever, some have a lot of marketing. I think the roles changed where 10, 15 years ago, it was like they were hiring bartenders because they had marketing and sales team to look after all of that. My role is strictly state education, which is great. Like, there's sales teams and marketing teams to look after all of that stuff. Am I involved with them? Yeah, I get to play part, which is great because I learn. But the rules of the game have changed. They'll bring on people who are great marketing backgrounds with maybe no skill set behind a bar. They might bring in some bartenders. I had someone reach out that had no experience with anything, but they were from sales. I'm like, hey, if you know how to sell, I was like, that's a lot. Like, we can teach you the education part. And, even the bar part these days, like, they're not going to be doing much more than getting behind a booth making some cocktails. It used to be that we would go in and train bartenders. That's becoming less and less and less. Like, it's very rare that I go in and teach bartenders how to make cocktails now. If we hire bartenders for our videos, I'll make the videos for Old Fashions and Manhattans, but we hire the people that maybe I used to train and educate, but they would train and educate me now in all the new ways of working. So I think if you want to get into it, you got to be diligent. You've got to be make a list of spirit companies and websites and get on there every day. If it's something, it's same as somebody, if they want to learn how to bartend, you're going to have to start somewhere. So you're probably going to go in and get a job bussing or bar backing or work your way up behind the bar. Though these days, like you say, that there's a lot more jobs available. So maybe you get in and you can study online and learn online and buy books. Same thing with whiskey. It's like, buy books, learn, take courses. So if you do get that interview, you know what you're talking about, or have half an idea what you're talking about.
Yeah.
But it's kind of like the bar world. If I was told tomorrow that I needed to start bringing on a bunch of Canadian whiskey ambassadors, I'm not going to be looking just for their skill set behind a bar or their whiskey knowledge. I can teach that. We can teach that. I need personality.
I literally did a podcast this week about hiring for personality over skill set.
Yeah, you can't teach that. Like, if I get somebody who's just a little too shy to speak to a crowd and mumbling, and then we can't overcome that. Even that you could fix, but there's only so much you could work on if you're going to bring somebody on. I'm assuming anybody that wants to become a brand ambassador for a whiskey or any spirit's going to have some kind of passion towards that spirit and some knowledge. There's nothing you can't learn nowadays with the courses out there and the books and online videos. It's like you say, the amount of at-home bartenders due to the shutdown of the world for a couple of years, like these
TikTok bartenders, and they're getting book deals now. It's crazy.
Yeah, so
it's crazy. At-home bartenders from the pandemic now getting book deals and like TV shows and are in PR incubators and stuff like that. It is kind of insane just how connected we can be just through social media.
Oh, that's wild.
It is wild.
Wild.
Looking ahead over the next 12 months, what's exciting for you over the next 12 months? Because I'm curious, because being 10 years, staying fresh and innovative in your role as the brand ambassador, the next 12 months, what do you blue sky it for me? What do you see as exciting for you?
Well, you're right. It's very hard to stay fresh. Gina and I heading up all the events, all the activations, all the education, advocacy. We're going to start putting out some new things that we haven't done before. So, if you find yourself coming down to Portland Cocktail Week, Mr. Soole, we've got, Gina would kill me if I said what we're doing right now, but you're going to see it online. We've got something really fun set up that we think we're going to be able to take to different cities. We need to really test this. So we're working on different activations that we can recreate in different markets is one thing we're focusing on. We're focusing on education and books, talking about book deals. We're starting a book club in Detroit right now where quarterly we'll bring in different authors and purchasing books for the bar community, and then during the day and during the evening more consumer, but trying to share the love with people that have taken the time to write about us, whether they're using Lot 40 in a cocktail or JP Weiser's in their whiskey section. Trying to support them, buy a large amount of books for the community, but also giving back to the community that are using our brands in their cocktails and saying, take a Monday afternoon off and come out and we get you some books. We're going to show you around. And if that developed and worked, I mean, we could see that going to other markets. But I mean, on our end, it's just constantly developing new ways to engage people. As far as the distillery goes, if somebody from brand team is here right now, they could talk to me about what's coming out. I mean, there's some cool whiskeys coming out. We just put out the JP Weiser's 42, and they're doing a series with decade series. So it's going to be from different decades, and there's a story behind them with the barrels, which would be really cool. Lot 40 is going to stay with getting pretty innovative. I can say it because it's officially happening. There's the new cast strength this year is a cherry wood finish.
Ooh.
It's pretty spectacular. And I've already heard what they're doing for next year. So, I mean, there's some really good stuff coming down the pipeline whiskey-wise. And education, we're just going to keep taking it up and up. The ABC's course has worked out for us so well that there are a few things happening that, again, I would be strangled if I said this live, but there's going to be some things where it's going to grow quite a bit, because the only problem we have with it now is we can't accommodate everybody at all the time. So we've been working on a way that we can get to everybody. Yeah, because we want to get to everybody.
Yeah, because I think we chatted about maybe bringing it to Victoria, and you were just like, there's so many moving parts with it that it's not something that can be cookie cutted across markets.
Well, I'll tell you this now too. Gina and I, when we were texting the other night, you and I, Gina was sitting next to me, and I was like, oh, I'm texting Shawn. I'm like, she came up with a kind of cool idea that we'll take offline, but I think we got something for you've been so good to me over the years and our brands, and I've not been able to come to Victoria, that I'm changing that in the very new year. If you'll have us, we're going to do something together.
Doors always open. So we've come to the time of the podcast that I usually find most guests get taken back by these questions. So we're doing the 5 last deep questions for Dave Mitton for the podcast. What is one lesson or experience that has shaped your perspective the most, and how do you carry that forward in your life?
Holy shit. Why didn't you send these even before? This really is live, folks. Say that again.
So what is the one lesson or experience that has shaped your perspective the most, and how do you carry that forward in your life?
I mean, this is going to sound just kind of like a bullshit answer, but 20 years working behind a bar, like, don't treat everybody the way you treat your mother, for fuck's sakes. Like, be kind to everyone. There's so many people out there that just aren't nice. Like, be nice to everybody. And I try to, go through life. Like, even if you're having a bad day, it's like you got to step back from it. It's like, just be nice. Like, everybody has the ability to be a bit of a dickhead at times, but just, try to be nice to everyone. You don't know what someone's gone through, what they're going through. It's not always easy to be nice, but just be nice.
That's a good one. If you could leave one lasting message or piece of wisdom for the world, what would it be and why?
Damn you. I could have better answers if I had time to think about this.
Come on, you know me. I like the raw answers.
this could come across as privileged, but it's one of those things like, I don't want to say work hard and no matter what, your dreams will come true. But I mean, it is kind of hokey and cliche. And it's like a few things I've done in my life with a couple of the bars, restaurants, and, I've had people, naysayers, like, say I wouldn't bother if I were you. Like, it's not possible. And, don't ever give up. So cliche. But I mean, work, don't ever stop, tenacity. Like, if opportunity doesn't knock, build a door. I think somebody famous said that, but it is,
I agree with that. I live by the rule that anything's possible, and possible just takes a little longer.
Yeah. I mean, like you say, we were talking offline. I'm working on some stuff right now where I actually think it's going to be impossible, but I'm hoping that I can pull out some more surprises before my time's up in the next few years.
Nice.
Yeah. Never give up.
Looking back on your journey, what is something you wish you had understood earlier in life?
Read more.
Mm.
I wish I would have read more, because now I've realized, I'm like, oh, I really like reading. I was someone in younger, like teen years, that would have been more about working on cars, watching movies, watching TV instead of, reading. There's just such a world out there.
Nice.
All the knowledge you can learn.
How do you define success, and has the definition of it changed over time?
Yeah, 100%. I mean, just paying attention. I was someone who was taught to respect your elders, and I actually think I did it, where I would listen to grandparents and people who are much, much older and experienced and wiser than me, and listen to them. And it takes me a while, as somebody who's happiest when they're nonstop working. But that work-life balance, like, do what you love. And again, from a place of privilege, I've been very fortunate that I've always been able to do what I love. And maybe that won't last. I mean, maybe tomorrow it will be gone. I think happiness and peace is much more important than money. And I mean, I'm coming from someone, like, I don't own a home. It's not like I don't have a flush bank account by any means. But I've been happy. I've been having fun. And there's been some opportunities I've turned down where that might have gone the other way, and I would have made a lot more money, but maybe I wouldn't have enjoyed it as much. So I've been having a good time in all of my years, and enjoying life and getting to see the world. And just, if you can do what you love and get paid for it from a place of privilege, it's incredible. But do what you love.
What do you hope your legacy will be?
He was a nice guy who always wanted to help others and could make a great drink. I mean, I don't know if I'll have a legacy. I'd probably be forgotten about pretty quick.
Oh, we'll talk about it for a couple of days. Everybody thinks that get talked about a couple of days, and then a year later but
I'd like to think that if I was gone tomorrow, that I would be missed, and people would generally think, like, say, he was a good guy. He was a good guy that tried to help people and be there and not just think about himself.
Well, I think that if you're the epitome of a Canadian whiskey ambassador. Like, if you go to AI and go, draw me a picture of a typical Canadian whiskey ambassador, it's just you. It's just you and denim, all the time.
There's some pretty great people out there representing the brands and spirits these days.
Man, I really appreciate you taking time out, because I know that you have got a busy schedule. So I always appreciate when friends have a time to sit down and rehash old conversations we've had. Like, I really did. I talked to someone the other day who does a podcast as well, and he was talking about, like, audio issues and everything being perfect. I'm like, dude, one of my biggest listened episodes to this day is yours, which was one of my very first ones. And I remember doing it at San Antonio Cocktail Week. We had to change, like, locations like 2 or 3 times. I had it was literally my third or fourth episode, so I had the dinkiest pieces of equipment, and it's still incredible that people like listen the whole way through and like were engaged with it. So I'm just always appreciative of having chances to sit down and chat to people who I revere as peers and good friends.
Well, it's always an honor. The fact that you asked me back for a third time blows me away, and I'm honored. And I agree. From someone who's been able to do a lot of really fun podcasts over the years, like that was certainly the most entertaining.
Yeah.
I mean, we had Sam Kasuga in the background at one point yelling at me, and like it's just like I'm sure it wasn't me they were listening to. They probably just wanted to know what was going to happen next.
Well, man, thank you so much for your time. Have a good day, and I really appreciate being on the show.
Thank you for having me, Shawn.
Thanks, buddy. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thanks for listening, Pose Shifters. I hope you enjoyed that episode. I really enjoy sitting down with friends and peers and just chatting about the industry and getting down to the nuts and bolts of what's really going on out there. Make sure you like, subscribe, comment, everything on all the platforms. Just hit it up and I'll do my best to answer any queries or questions you have. I'll see you next week, guys. Bye.